Hi ladies, welcome to the notes, beginning first couple of pages for speciation. So we're going to essentially kind of take a step back and we're going to look at some of the larger picture pieces of evolution, and then we're also going to take a closer look at this idea of speciation. So essentially, how do we start with one organism and over this extremely long amount of time end up with an entirely different organism? Or how do organisms end up diverging from other organisms? So in order to talk about this, it's absolutely necessary that we take a step back and just for a moment talk about one of the first people to really discuss evolution, which would be Darwin. I'd mentioned before that Darwin went on this famous trip. He was on a boat for quite some time. He was on the HMS Beagle, essentially sailing around the world, and one of the places that he spent a lot of time was the Galapagos Islands, and we'll actually discuss the Galapagos later. But Darwin really believed that all things, and when we say all things, we really truly mean all living things, are descended from common ancestors. And these are going to be ancient common ancestors. So when we take a look at this, Darwin actually, if we looked at his original paper, and you can actually read his book, it is called The Origin of Species, but he called this descent with modification. Now, this idea of the descent of different species from a common ancestor, this would take many, many generations. Darwin looked at certain living organisms. He also looked at fossil evidence, but this descent took many, many generations. All right, so then it would be important to kind of take a step back and again to think about, well, when we talk about a species, as a friendly reminder, what is a species? And if we wanted to be really, really technical about this, we could use what we call the biological species concept. The idea behind the biological species concept is that we have a really clear-cut, easy way of defining what a species is. We've sort of touched on this before when we discussed this with populations. Now we're going to be even more specific. So, for two organisms to be separate species, they must not be able to interbreed. Emphasis on not here. Okay, so speciation then, if we're looking at this particular process, it refers to events in which two or more species arise. All right, so we have this idea, a little bit better defined idea of what a species is, and then in order to create new species, two or more, from one, we're looking at a specific event, and we want to see exactly how that happens. And the answer, kind of the easy answer, I suppose, to this question is this idea of isolation. So the very first piece of isolation that we're going to discuss is the idea of behavioral isolation. This is going to be separation of two populations when they develop differences in courtship or other behaviors. We've kind of gotten this idea that behaviors are really important. We talked about this before when we talked about populations and identifying a species as being different. And what's really important here is that these differences in behaviors here are actually going to prevent them from breeding. It's really difficult to mate with an organism if you don't recognize certain things, such as courtship dances. That's very popular with bird species. Or songs, here again, bird species, not always. It could also be things like whales. Coloration. We talked a little bit about the peacock before. That'll be a good example there. Or pheromones, those chemical signals that are saying, let's mate. So when we have this separation of populations, they're doing some kind of behavior, something different that prevents them from breeding. They don't interbreed. As a result, we end up with two different species. That is our speciation event. Two or more species are arising because of these changes in behaviors that lead them to no longer breed. In addition to looking at behavioral isolation, there are some other types of isolation we could potentially look at. The next most important one kind of is the next step. So after behavioral isolation, we would then take a look at this idea of reproductive isolation. In the instance of reproductive isolation, two organisms do not interbreed or don't produce fertile offspring. This is kind of a catch-all definition. Here is where we kind of lump in some other things. So the inability to interbreed is one thing, or they don't produce fertile offspring. That would be organisms like our mule. The mule is not a separate species because, in fact, it is not fertile. It cannot produce other mules. Mules only come from mating of horse and donkey. All right, now, if we were to take a look, there are essentially three types of reproductive isolation. There are three ways in which populations are unable to interbreed or produce fertile offspring. The first way that we'll talk about is mechanical. So when we talk about mechanical, this is strictly taking a look at anatomy. Anatomical differences prevent breeding or pollination. And I always mention pollination because a lot of times we forget that this also occurs with plants too. Those are species as well, and it's not just animals that this type of separation occurs in. I feel like mechanical isolation is simply a really easy way of saying that parts don't fit. All right, the next type that we could talk about would be gametic. In gametic isolation, then, specifically, egg and sperm are sex cells. The two cells required to do sexual reproduction are chemically incompatible. Realistically, what this means is that they won't fuse. The final form of reproductive isolation, then, is postzygotic. In postzygotic isolation, zygotes form but die. Or hybrids born are infertile. All right, so that's it for reproductive isolation. Stay tuned and we will talk about temporal isolation and geographic isolation.